A heartfelt thanks to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, the National Film Development Corporation, and the Satyajit Ray Film and Television Institute, Kolkata. This session will discuss the impact of India's rich cultural narratives and storytelling techniques that captivate audiences across the globe. Our distinguished speakers will share the perspectives on creating content that not only entertains us but also influences. Join me in welcoming with an enthusiastic applause Ms. Daniela Walker, a German-Argentine documentary producer and director, Ms. Wendy Robbins, executive producer, The Commandant's Shadow, and Mr. Sajan Raj Kurup, founder of Creative Land Studios. And please welcome with them our moderator for this evening, Mr. Mayank Shekhar, a renowned film critic, writer, and head of entertainment at Midday. Audience, we shall also welcome your questions at the conclusion of the session, so please be prepared to engage and hold on to your queries. And now that we have our guests settled, may I please request Mr. Mayank sir to take this insightful discussion on forward.
Well, what we promise will be an insightful discussion on, of course, the film, The Commandant's Shadow. We'll be looking at the larger documentary scene in general. But I think what we will start this conversation with is getting to know the three people on this panel better, to know your lives, to know your journeys, and of course, how did you get into films firstly? And in particular, how did you get into the movie, The Commandant's Shadow? I've just seen the film. It's a fascinating account. Totally moves you. It's a touching film that makes its debut at the Mumbai International Film Festival tomorrow. It does its Asia premiere in Mumbai tomorrow, which also has an India connection. All of these things that we look at. But I'm going to start with you, Daniela. Argentinian, German movie on Jews, Holocaust, with the Indian man here, with the British woman there, both of them involved with the film. What is your life story firstly, and how did you get into this movie?
So I'm half Argentinian, half German, grew up partly in Colombia and ended up in Britain, where I eventually got a job at the BBC. So I was there for about 11, 12 years, making films around the world, including in India many times. And I've since worked on one-off documentaries and series for Netflix, CNN, PBS, a lot of really international channels. And Wendy will talk about how we met, because we met in India, and it has a lot to do with filmmaking and the BBC.
But how did this film happen to you in particular, The Commandant's Shadow?
I was initially contacted by the daughter of an Auschwitz survivor about making a film about her experiences of trauma. And because I make longer films, I felt it was an element of a story, but not a story on its own. So I started looking around. I came across the autobiography written by Rudolf Höss, which I was amazed no one had ever made a documentary about. It's a unique document because he was both perpetrator and prime witness, but very unusual. And then I came across his descendants. He has a son and had a daughter. She died after we filmed her, and a grandson who was the same generation as Maya, the survivor's daughter. So it all came together gradually and organically, developed into a story you saw.
Well, I'll tell you about the origins, how Daniela and I met, and then how Raj was involved as well. So this film is, as Daniela was saying, about a father and son and a mother and daughter. And the father and son are the son and grandson of what's been called the world's biggest mass murderer, Rudolf Höss, who killed 1.3 million people at the death camp Auschwitz in Poland during the Second World War. And his son and grandson go on a journey in the film, which hopefully you'll see tomorrow, to come to terms with their hereditary burden and what their ancestor did. And as part of the film, they come and meet our mother and daughter in London, and the mother is a nearly 99-year-old survivor of the camp. And the extraordinary thing about Daniela's film is that the death camp Auschwitz was experienced by the son of the commandant and Anita, our survivor, who were on literally different sides of the fence. As our Hans-Jürgen, who is 87, he was the son of the commandant, as he was playing in the garden where his father was the boss of the death camp, our survivor was playing for her life the cello in an orchestra to try and stay alive. So the film is about the moment 80 years later that these two people across the divide meet. Now, Daniela and I met just once in India, in this fantastic country of yours, in a place called Gwalior, where we were making a film about the BBC. And it was one of those very intense filming experiences. We were trying to capture very difficult things on camera. And as a result, in those 10 days in India, we really bonded and we shared lots of intimate stories, as you do when you're on the road. And I was telling her about my Jewish family, the Jewish side called the Goldsteins, and all the funny stories about them. For some reason, we didn't talk again for 25 years. We left India, we never spoke to each other or saw each other again. And then I got a call from Daniela out of the blue, and she was a little bit in a low mood because she'd been trying to make this film for nearly 4 years, and she'd run out of money and run out of ideas and run out of places to go. And she found me in her phone, and she thought, oh, Wendy Robbins. I remember her telling me a story when we were in India about the Goldstein family, the Jewish family she knew. Maybe she knows a way that we can get this film made. She called me, and would you believe, 2 weeks before, I had had a lunch with the publisher and best friend of J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books. And we were speaking to him about Harry Potter and different documentaries. When we left the lunch, he said, oh, by the way, if you ever come across anything interesting about the Holocaust, my father died, and he wanted to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. So if you ever have anything interesting, please do come back to me. I might help you with the funding of it. 2 weeks later, Daniela calls, and when she sent me the footage of what she had filmed, I got goosebumps. I had that moment where I thought, this is something really special, really unique. And we managed to get some funding from J.K. Rowling's publisher and agent. And then we had one big evening in London where Daniela and I did this passionate pitch about the importance of this film, because it has all sorts of lessons about not forgetting the past, coming to terms with things, and trying to talk to people who are not like you to build bridges. And at that event, Raj was there. And Raj, well, you can carry on, Raj. And anyway, Raj very kindly invested in the film that night. He said it spoke to him and it resonated with him. And we actually in the end got quite a lot of funding from such a diverse group of people. But everything about this film, like I was telling you about Us Two in India, and then the J.K. Rowling guy, everything has been serendipity and moments of extraordinary coincidence. And we're very blessed to be sitting here today telling you about it.
Because I should say, you can have the best story in the world, you can have filmed it in the best possible way, you know, it's always about the money. That's one thing I've come to learn. So, you know, if I'd known how hard it would be to raise enough money to finish the film, you know, perhaps I would have never started it, so it was a good thing I didn't. But yeah, the funding is really important, as everyone here probably knows. So, you know, that was a really extraordinary event to get all of you together, everyone putting in money to allow us to basically get the film ready.
So for all the people who are going to watch this film tomorrow, you obviously played a footage from the movie at the fundraiser where Raj was there. What was that footage? What did you see, and what was it that really moved you? What did you watch?
Yeah, so I'll backtrack a little bit and just give a bit of a thing about, you know, you remember Cinema Paradiso, the kid?
Yes.
So if that kid grew up in India, that would be me, right? So I spent, since the age of 7, I grew up in a design school. I never studied there, but I learned a lot. And I was usually...
Like parents were teachers at the design school?
No, my father was the chief secretary of NIT, so
Okay.
we just grew up on campus,
Right.
privilege, right? And what happened is that, but I grew up like a kid in a candy store, and I remember just I was fascinated by cinema, and I used to really genuinely crack deals with the projector man, because most of the films were like Godard and all that. It's all A, right? Like, so, you know, kids are not allowed, right? But I used to stand in the projector room and watch it. So that film really resonated with me, and it's always stayed with me, right? So that's where the journey is, and then I stumbled into advertising. I did multiple things, and then sort of decided to invest in a very interesting content company in the UK, and that's how I met Wendy and the entire gang there. And you know, this was a film that was on the slate, which I really thought was it was a very powerful sort of the log line was so powerful and really interesting, just the way. And then when I was there, Neil Blair was actually doing a fundraiser at the Warner Theatre, and I saw the trailer for the first time, and I was like, and I could visibly see every single person, once the trailer was played, it was just pin drop silence, and they were all kind of, everyone was moved, and I could feel the emotion was kind of palpable in that room. And in that moment, I just walked up to Neil and I said, Neil, I'm putting in some money, and Neil just that's the first time he was very Indian about it. He just like that and just hugged me.
Neil is the Harry Potter man.
Yeah. And he's like, we're gonna do this, right? And that was the beginning of the journey. It was just beautiful, and then I just loved the way it's kind of turned out, and the kind of accolades it's getting all over the world, and how it's getting recognized. It's just these two ladies and the extended team who really sort of put a fabulous piece of work together. I'm really proud of it.
But Raj, for someone who actively invests in media in general, this is an investment in a documentary film. Do you think over the past decade or so, there's been huge interest in documentaries as a genre for multiple reasons? One is distribution has become easier. I can watch it on Netflix anywhere in the world, something that I couldn't do before. Do you think that, and especially with Indian documentaries, do you think there's been a serious surge with not just the investment, but also interest levels and the way they've traveled in the past few years, Raj?
I sincerely do agree, and I think there are some circumstantial reasons why documentaries have also, you know, it's always been great. You know, documentaries are always something that doesn't take as much time. You know, obviously there's
Well, it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of research, but it, you know, the story is sort of very clear, right? It's a lot more in control, right? And some of the paraphernalia that's involved is not there. It's got its own other challenges. But one interesting thing that happened post the SAG strike and everything was that the whole market started really opening up thanks to the streamers, where there's been a demand. And I've seen that people have started really investing in really strong documentaries, because there's some really interesting stories to be told in the world. And so to say, probably the world wants to watch really interesting true stories, right? And I've seen that people are actually sort of being able to not just invest in documentaries because they feel for it, but it also makes sense business-wise to sort of really. So I really feel I do see that trend happening, and it's only going to be here for a longer while.
Right. I mean, I'm also bringing in the idea of documentaries here because when you look at the story, I'm guessing both of your colleagues at BBC at some point. That's what it was, right? And of course, making documentaries at the time too for BBC Television or BBC Studios, as it were. Now, if we take this particular story, and again, I wish that all of you had already seen the film before we discuss, but you'll see it tomorrow. So it's treated as a promo in some form. But the person we're talking about, Rudolf Höss, clearly the biggest mass murderer in world history, responsible for 1.5 million deaths at the Auschwitz camp. Now, that same story has been dealt with in very different ways. So you take a book by Martin Amis in 2014. She's inspired by that character, but builds a completely different story. You take, of course, last year, Zone of Interest. Zone of Interest was also the Martin Amis novel, where Jonathan Glazer takes that same story and builds another narrative. How do you think your documentary film, in terms of its intention, or what it's trying to say, is different from the Jonathan Glazer movie that picked up the Oscars last year, or for that matter, the Martin Amis book that was widely loved in 2014?
So it's a bit in London, people say when you wait for a bus, it doesn't come, and then you get two at once. So it's a bit like that. Actually, I started my film, and as I said, it developed from being contacted really by the survivor's daughter into becoming, very much also about the perpetrators. Because I always felt there cannot be a survivor or even a victim without a perpetrator, so they're stories that belong together. And they obviously were making a fiction film adapting a book, so they're very different. My documentary really deals with, almost an entire century, and the fiction film deals with the year 1943 and a few months of 1944. That we mustn't forget it. I think that's one of the messages of our film. It's really, you have to know the past in order to really be able to overcome it. And, we end our film obviously with a message of hope, which is also important. Our Holocaust survivor meeting Rudolf Höss's son and saying we have to talk to each other. That can be applied to all sorts of other conflict situations.
I think another key difference, obviously the film with Jonathan Glazer and our documentary cover the same family, who were the only civilians living in Auschwitz at the time. As Daniela says, we cover a longer period, but the other differences, I think, are, one, the house that the Höss family lived in is actually still there. Now, in the Zone of Interest, Jonathan Glazer and the team didn't get access to it. They built another house. Daniela here actually got into the real house. There was a Polish family living there, and she persuaded them to let us film. So taking, as you'll see in the film tomorrow, taking the son of Rudolf Höss back to his actual home, letting him go back to his bedroom, where he remembers seeing chimneys from his bedroom window, which actually were the crematoria, where his father was burning over 1 million people, is actually quite something. And the other thing, I think, is whereas the Zone of Interest doesn't actually mention the Holocaust, there are lots of very clever but obscure clues about what might have been happening over the garden fence. But this documentary fully immerses in the horror. Daniela has found the most extraordinary archive, some of it unseen before, so you're left in no doubt of what was happening on the other side of the garden fence. And we're living in a time where the world is very quick to deny atrocities that happen around the world very quickly, as we've seen recently with October the 7th. And the level of ignorance about things like the Holocaust and what human beings are capable of doing to each other is very high, particularly among young people. So to have a documentary like this that leaves you in no doubt of what happened, and then cleverly to have the actual son of the perpetrator reading his father's own words and saying, I didn't realise my father was doing this, but these are his words and it must be true, really gives you a chilling effect and leaves you in no doubt of what really happened. And just a little word on this manuscript, because I think it's an incredible story, and it's one of the things that made me have my goosebump moment when Daniela called me after 25 years of not seeing her last time in India. Before he was executed, a few weeks before he was executed, Rudolf Höss was in prison in Poland, and one of the guards gave him a pen and paper and said, look, just write your life story. And he wrote everything that had happened, literally from being born, from Himmler, Hitler's deputy, approaching him and asking him to find a concentration camp where they could exterminate many, many people. He writes the whole thing down, and it's weeks before he's executed. And Daniela, tell me what you told me about that, the true crime with the perpetrator.
Yeah, I sort of saw it almost like a true crime story in which the criminal wrote his deathbed confession, and that's why I could not believe no one had ever picked up on this document.
I found it fascinating that the son wasn't aware of this book. And is that even possible? And apparently the book was lying in his house. I mean, don't treat it as a spoiler. It's still as interesting a film, even if you know this fact. But did that really happen? I mean, the son did not know that the father wrote an autobiography.
So Rudolf Höss's son knew that his father had done something terrible. He knew he was the boss of Auschwitz, as he called it, and for that he was executed. What he refused very consciously every day for most of his life was to actually look at what exactly he had done, because his father didn't just run a death camp, he imagined it. So he was told by Himmler, you have to exterminate a large part of Europe's Jews, work it out. So he did, he created this apparatus of death, and he was then outside the gas chambers, crematoria, on the ramps when transports arrived, and he wrote it all down. So his son, I think, possibly as a way of protecting himself, just ignored this for the rest of his life, for his life, until I came along, really. It was like a really massive skeleton in the closet, just something he knew he didn't want to go there.
Right.
One of the most poignant moments, I think, of the film is because, obviously, his father, before he was executed, wrote to our contributor when he was 8 years of age. He wrote him a letter, as you'll see in the film, my darling little boy. He was 9. It's just going to be you and mummy now, and I'll always, please keep your affectionate nature. And I think one of the hardest things for our contributor is the fact that he knew his father as a very different person. The world knows Rudolf Höss as the murderer of 1.3 million people. His manuscript, which has been turned into a book, is full of agonizing evil. Yet this man, who Daniela spent 3 or 4 years interviewing, knew his father as a very loving family man. He would be putting women and children into the gas chamber, literally throwing children in, and then would go home and cuddle our contributor, read him stories and bath him and play in the garden with him. And that is such a strange thing. If you're that child, imagine trying to come to terms with such a different person than the one you grew up with.
One standout thing about it, and what makes this documentary really unique to me is the fact that usually stories are told about a time, but there's a paradox of time in this one. It's a story about another time told now, and the story unfolds as it happens between two people who were there then. That's very unique. It's not just looking at what happened then. It's about what's happening now between two people who would have never met then, right? So that the whole time dilation that's happening is what is extremely unique about the way the story is being told.
Also, I mean, when you mentioned earlier about how when they did the pitch, and there were all these potential investors, the 3 people who came up and raised their hands was a Muslim, a Hindu, and a Catholic person. It's that universal, you think, Raj, especially for you who got involved in much later, that this is a story that can happen anywhere in the world. Of course, Holocaust will be unique in the sense that I hope it never happens ever again, and we'll get into whether it will, because that's also the central question in the movie itself.
But do you think there is something about stories like these, because ultimately evil, is also a person, and that person can exist anywhere at any point in time. Is that what drew you to the subject?
So, I mean, I like the way you're looking at it. I just say, I feel that to me, did not matter where we came from. I think it was quite, the room resonated, and it just so happens that 3 people came from 3 different parts of the world.
It's a coincidence.
It's a coincidence, right? I think we're all, finally, at the end of the day, there are stories that need to be told. There are stories, unique aspects of the stories need to be seen. I feel that there have been many stories about Holocaust.
Way too many, and dealt with in very different ways. Like, Jojo Rabbit is very different from A Life is Beautiful, is very different from a Schindler's List, and it's the same.
But yet, there was a perspective which was not seen ever, right? Which was being beautifully brought forth by the Command and Shadow. And that's what, I mean, I think the perspective is what really moved everybody, because there are 2 sides, both sides exist, and both sides have their own narrative, and they both have their facts, and they both the truth. It's only when many years later, when they meet, there is some sort of a conclusion in their head, and that's what's beautiful. I think it's the perspective which this documentary brings together that makes it so
the people
unique.
coming face to face, almost like a closure in some form. I think for the audience, from Indian perspective, the one film I can think of is actually 3 short documentaries called Rubaru, which Amir Khan produced, which is again like a perpetrator and a survivor meeting, including 26/11, the attacks that happened here. What I find very interesting here is the fact that you mentioned contributor when you refer to people in the film. It's kind of uncomfortable sometimes when they're referred to as cast, right, or character. Take us through the process of making this, because especially when you're filming something as sensitive as this, are there portions in the film that you would not keep because it's just going too dark as a territory? Are there portions that you did not want to keep for other reasons? Are there things that we have not seen in this film, that we will not see in this film, that you wish was there or you chose not to keep?
Well, we had to, obviously we're already over an hour and a half, and I do watch a lot of other people's documentaries who send them, and I'm part of a mentorship program, so very often films are too long. So I basically had to just cut a lot of things, not because they were too dark, but because people would eventually sort of find the film is too long. And one of them was the backstory of the Hus family, because Kai, the grandson of the commandant, and his father, the son, hadn't really seen each other for many years.
Is that so?
They were out of touch for 30 years, then reconnected, and then didn't see each other for another 5 years. And I came along for that meeting, and I found it interesting how in trauma in the past, when something in the family is unresolved, it can create a sort of distance. But it was one theme too many in a way to explore. Even in an hour and a half, you can only tell a certain number of stories,
right.
And that was just too much.
And in an ideal world, we'd like to have included more of Poopy, who is Rudolf Hirsch's other surviving child, who was 90 when you filmed her. And that was, Raj was talking about the different perspectives in the film, and I think when you'll see it, you'll agree it's very multi-layered, and the perspectives are sort of like 360 degree. And one of the unique perspectives, and I'm told by Holocaust historians that this is the first time this has been captured on film, are 2 surviving children of such a senior Nazi. So Hans-Jürgen, our contributor, for want of a better word, goes to America, where, again, with that distance of trauma, he hasn't connected with his older sister, who he played with in the gardens of Auschwitz for 55 years. And Daniela films this extraordinary reunion of these 2 siblings, who almost immediately return to their 7 and 12-year-old selves. They're 87 and 90, actually, I think she's a little bit older. They're they're regressing to their childhood games they used to play. Hans-Jürgen, the son of the commandant, even wears a silly hat he used to wear when he played with his sister. And the sister is very much not on the same journey as her brother, who's now read the book and has faced up to his past. She is like, Mummy and Daddy were wonderful, and she wouldn't hear a word against them. And Daniela offered, as the kind filmmaker, many chances for her to say something, either something to condemn the Holocaust or something to condemn what her father did. And she was quite resolute in, we had the most wonderful mother and father, and I think my dad was very strong, and he had to do this. And she even utters the extraordinary line, if my father killed so many people, how come there are all these survivors? And you just think, wow, what a different journey you've been on to your brother.
Whole life. That's literally been her whole life. She's made herself believe something, which is right before the camera. When you take a film like this, and it's, for lack of a better word, a very dark subject, and you release it in 500 theaters across America, that's a tough call, Raj, in terms of the investment. 700 cinemas across America.
I think one is a huge. I think they believe quite a bit in this piece of work, and the theaters that we got is kind of testimony to how strongly they believe this film needs to be watched and seen and shared. So I'm very happy that it's got the number of screens.
Did the zone of interest help you also gain interest levels higher for this film because of how big that film became last year?
I think this film journey has been such a journey of serendipity, right from the story of how they met,
right,
to to things happening. And the example that Daniela was giving, when sometimes when a bus is delayed, it's for a reason. We couldn't be happier that somebody like Jonathan Glazer took a subject like that and actually sort of in another world, in a parallel world, decided to do that. Right, and we got people associated with that film as well who got on board and who sort of supported this and said that we love this story, and it just, I think every bit, if there was a God's Own Child sort of a film, this is actually one of those films.
And not that we're being competitive here, but you mentioned Zone of Interest. When we were in Berlin last week for the Berlin premiere, Warner Brothers told us that The Commandant Shadow, our documentary, is now going into more cinemas in Germany than the Zone of Interest.
Interesting, you bring up also the fact of what happens to generations after, and it's something that you've dealt with in the film as well, about an entire silent generation in Germany. They don't talk about it. They don't want to mention it. They don't want to think about it, which is literally also your contributor in the movie, as it were. Is that something you've noticed about the country itself? That's really what they went through post-World War and post-Hitler?
Yes, I think definitely. My father, although he lived a lot of his life in South America, was German, and he was 2 years older than Hans-Jürgen. So, his generation, born between 1935 and 45, after the war ended, it was almost like a veil of silence descended. It was almost like an unspoken convention that you don't look back. And of course, someone like Hans-Jürgen or the entire Hearst family, they didn't want to look back because the world they stood for no longer existed, and it was now, a terrible thing to have been associated with it quite so closely. So I think it wasn't until the 60s and the advent of, the leftist brigade, the Baader Meinhof, the Red Army faction, that was the generation that suddenly looked at their parents and said, what did you do during the war? So I think it took certainly about 2 decades until people started, to some extent, engaging with the past. But this sort of deep analysis, someone like Hans-Jürgen, even then could not bring himself to confront his past. I think as they become very much older and face their own mortality, some people feel it's something they need to tie up loose ends.
Daniela and I, talking of perspectives, had different perspectives. Originally, I'm Jewish. Some of my family died in the Holocaust, were killed. Daniela's non-Jewish German. And when I first met Hans-Jürgen, the son of the commandant, I didn't feel hostile towards him, but I felt why has he shown no curiosity to meet Jewish people? Or why has he not tried to put any light in the world, given that his father caused so much darkness? Now, obviously that's not his responsibility, it's not his fault. But I remember thinking the first time I met him, why have you led this quiet, anonymous life? You've done nothing of significance with your life in terms of Holocaust education. And Daniela very patiently explained to me what she's just said about that generation of German men. Some of them, to cope with it, almost made themselves small and quiet. And I now have a very different perspective on Hans-Jürgen, which is that I see him as something of a hero. He's found his moral courage. And at this stage of his life, aged 87, he didn't need to put himself on the public stage like this. This film is going around the world, it's really being talked about, and there he is, making himself vulnerable, exposing himself, and talking about the terrible, terrible crimes of his father. So I'm very happy, and it shows you also that at any age we can find our moral courage.
Would you take your contributors across whenever the screenings happen? Would they be comfortable to come? I mean, they're of course already comfortable being in front of the camera, but would they be comfortable to be out there on the stage? I mean, it's taken an 87-year-old man this long to even deal with it. If there wasn't her camera, he would have left the world without having dealt with it at all. Would they be comfortable being out there on the stage?
Yeah, mainly they are. Hans-Jürgen, the son, spent a few months in hospital, so he came to our Berlin premiere, but he wasn't quite strong enough to be on stage and talk publicly. You know, that is something that you have to get used to. But he was definitely there, and because I've interviewed him so many times over such a long period of time, I felt quite confident answering for him because I know what he would say. And believe me, it took me a long time to actually draw out proper, useful information. When I first interviewed him, I went with a German cameraman who said to me as we were packing up, forget it, there's no story here. He didn't see anything, can't remember anything, doesn't talk. You know, he said yes and no pretty much. So let's go home. But you know, sometimes you have a nose for a story, and I just thought if I stick around for long enough, you know, there will be something really worthwhile. And you know, just the fact, I mean, I'd like to say, because documentaries, for them to get like a general release in a cinema is extraordinary. I mean, that Warner Brothers is just such a vote of confidence that, you know, we're getting basically the same release of Dune 2, you know, in terms of
or Barbie.
reach. Or Barbie. It's actually, we had the same team that did Barbie and Dune 2.
How cool is that? You know, that's what changes about documentaries, Raj. I mean, you mentioned how they're more under control as against the big budget movies, but the fact is that they're actually not under control. She can take her entire team and meet a person and get yes and no for an answer and spend years doing that, whereas you have to put in the money for it. Do you think it becomes a little harder then to invest in documentaries than features that are fiction, because these are the actors, these are the people, these are the places you need to go and shoot and come back? This is a hard investment to make.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, but that's something. When there's a story, and what Daniel just said, once you know that there's a nose for a story, I think it's you're always betting not just on you're betting on the filmmaker. Because you know their power to be able to go and pull that story out.
I think the other thing that you mentioned, Raj, earlier in the conversation is about relevance of a story and how relevant the story is. And it's also a central question that you bring out through your contributors is, can Holocaust happen again? One. Second, we've already seen levels of violence that I think may be unprecedented from the time of the 40s. In any case, as we speak, there are two wars going on, whether it's Hamas and Israel or what's going on in Gaza. I want you to sort of delve into that aspect of the film and of the world we live in, because that's really where the movie is going. What do you make of Gaza? What do you make of what happened in Israel? What do you make of the current political situation? And how does one stop this cycle of violence, according to you, as an artist, as a filmmaker?
So I think, I mean, our documentary has its own time and space, and by the time October the 7th happened, for example, we were about to send a cut to HBO. who we had a sort of first refusal with. So I think it got delayed, and we started thinking, how can we sort of in a way reflect, as you say, the biggest, anti-Semitic incident, a pogrom really, in our film without, in a way, stepping out of the time and space it deals with. So we went back to, I went through the interviews, and interestingly, Anita, who obviously lived through it the first time round, she kept saying to me, something like the Holocaust could happen again. It would look differently, but it could. And she sort of said human beings just behave atrociously badly. So it was interesting that she made it about how we are as humans. It's just intrinsic in us, the capacity for destruction. So we I built in a bit more of that to give the film maybe some relevance, because it would be weird if you didn't mention anything at all, but without explicitly mentioning. Because, I always think there's content and context. And to me, the 7th of October, for example, is the context within which our film now exists, but it's not part of the actual content.
No, I think that's true. I mean, after the Hamas atrocity in Israel on October the 7th, we were really thinking, do we have to go back and interview people again to make it more relevant? But it was finding those bits in the film that made it more up to date. So, for example, Daniela found a bit in Our Rushes of Hans-Jürgen, the 87-year-old man in Auschwitz, having just witnessed the gallows upon which his father was hanged and contemplating what his father had done. And he says, Daniela says to him, "Is this what you imagined?" And he says, "This is unimaginable. I can only hope that we have learned from this, but I don't think we have, or there wouldn't be so much anti-Semitism as there is in the world today." And when you look at what's happening in the world today, those words are so prescient, but they were recorded, as were Anita's words, way before what's been happening, the terrible darkness that's hit the world since October the 7th.
So I feel storytelling should have purpose, but no ego. I don't think any film in the world can stop a war, right? To me, if I really want to, if that's how I feel, I would run for office. But as a filmmaker, I think what's most important, and as somebody who would love to back great stories, I think it's all about the honesty with which you tell the story, the relevance of the story, and just making sure that it's spreads itself for a larger audience to be aware. I think that's where it ends, right? Beyond that, it's very difficult for it to be a commentary on the state of the world, or the times that we live in. Much has been spoken about it. If you really feel about it, get out of your job, go and fight elections and run the office, is what I would always say.
Well, also it's a story that is in every way possible, a mirror also of the times we live in. That's what all great stories do. This has been a great storytelling session from all of you. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you everyone for being here. And of course, please look forward to the film. I'm definitely going to watch it again as Command and Shadow makes its premiere, Asia premiere in Mumbai tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful story and such an insightful session. With that, I would now request Mr. Prithul Kumar, Joint Secretary Broadcasting, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and Managing Director, NFTC, to felicitate our guests. Also taking this moment to thank our esteemed speakers for their valuable insights into today's topic. We recognize the National Film Development Corporation for organizing this festival under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and extend a special thanks to you, my audience, for participating this evening. Thank you so much. This is your host, Ayushi Dholakia, signing off for the day.
आप देख रहे हैं डीडी भारती।